On the day they finally dragged her to the execution platform, Duchess Elara Voss did not cry. She did not beg. She simply looked up at the gray Valcrest sky and laughed, a soft, broken laugh that made even the executioner's hands shake. For 6 years, every noble in this kingdom had called her a monster. They said she poisoned her own aunt. They said she had a servant girl whipped until her spine showed. They said she smiled while doing it, and Elara believed it too. Right up until 3 days before her death, when a single memory did not belong to her surfaced in her mind, like a drowned body rising to the surface of a lake. A memory of a hairpin, a whispered spell, and a cousin's voice saying, "Nobody will ever suspect the villainess, that's the beauty of it." By then it was too late to speak. By then the kingdom had already decided who the monster was, but death, it turns out, is not always the end of a story. Sometimes it is only the place where the truth finally wakes up. When Elara opened her eyes again, she was 11 years old, standing in the exact same garden where everything had first gone wrong, and this time she remembered everything. The garden smelled of wet stone and crushed mint, and for one long, dizzying moment, Elara Voss could not understand why she was breathing. She had felt the rope. She remembered the rope, the rough fiber biting into her wrists, the crowd's silence stretching so tight it felt like it might snap the sky in half. She remembered closing her eyes and thinking, at least it will be quiet now. But it was not quiet. It was loud with birdsong. It smelled like spring. She looked down at her hands, small hands, unscarred hands, a child's hands, and her breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. "Lady Elara," a woman's voice, gentle and familiar in a way that made her chest ache. "You've been standing there a long while. Are you unwell?" Elara turned, and the sight nearly buckled her knees. Nanny Ophelia, dead for 4 years in the life she remembered, poisoned the court had whispered by Elara's own hand. Though Elara had never understood why anyone believed she would hurt the only person who had ever brushed her hair, without pulling, who had ever hummed lullabies in the dark, when the manor's halls grew cold with her parents' silence. "I'm fine," Elara said, and her voice came out high and thin, a child's voice wearing her own grief like an ill-fitting coat. "I just had a strange dream." She had not had a dream. She had had an entire life, 19 years of it, ending on a platform in front of a kingdom that hated her, all of it now folded backward into an 11-year-old body standing in her family's private garden on the morning of the summer cotillion. The morning it all began, she knew this day. She would remember this day in her nightmares for the rest of whatever life she'd been given now, because this was the day her cousin Miriel arrived at Voss Manor to stay, just for the season, sweet-faced and soft-spoken. With eyes the color of a winter pond and a laugh like breaking glass dressed up as music. This was the day Elara had in her first life walked into the eastern sitting room and found her favorite mare Willow lying dead in the stable yard below the window, throat cut, and Elara's own riding gloves discarded beside the body soaked through with blood that was not her own. She had screamed. She remembered screaming. She remembered no one believing that she hadn't done it, not even her own mother, who had looked at her with something curdling behind her eyes that Elara at 11 had no name for yet. Now she did. It was called suspicion. It was called the first brick in a wall that would eventually become a cage, and then a noose. "There's to be riding this afternoon," Ophelia said, tucking a loose curl behind Elara's ear with the same tenderness Elara remembered and had for 6 long years believed she'd imagined out of desperate loneliness. "Your cousin arrives before luncheon, Lady Miriel Thorne, such a sweet girl by all accounts." Elara's stomach turned to ice. "I don't want to go riding today," she said quickly. Too quickly she saw Ophelia's brow furrow. "I mean, I'd like to check on Willow first, personally, before anyone else goes near the stables. Whatever for my lady. Because in 8 years that horse would be a corpse and I will be blamed for it," Elara thought. And the thought was so absurd, so impossible, that for a moment she almost laughed the way she had laughed on the execution platform, not from humor, but from the sheer unbearable weight of carrying a truth no one else could see. "A feeling," she said instead. "Humor me." She was 11 years old and already lying beautifully, already understanding something she hadn't understood the first time she lived through this, that the truth, spoken plainly, would only make her sound insane. If she wanted to survive this life, if she wanted to save herself and Willow and whatever fragile shape her future still had left to take, she would need to become something she had never let herself be the first time. Careful, watchful, quietly, patiently ruthless. By the time she reached the stables, her heart hammering so hard she thought the grooms must surely hear it, Willow was alive. Alive and irritable, stamping at flies in the afternoon heat, utterly unaware that in another version of this exact day she had already stopped breathing. Elara pressed her forehead against the mare's warm neck and for the first time since waking in this borrowed second chance of a body, allowed herself to shake. "I know what's coming," she whispered against the horse's mane. I know what you're going to do to me. And this time I'm not going to let you." She did not yet know how right and how catastrophically insufficient that promise would turn out to be. Because 3 hours later a carriage bearing the Thorne family crest rolled up the long gravel drive of Voss Manor. And stepping out of it, golden-haired doe-eyed dressed in mourning gray for a mother who had died just months before under circumstances the kingdom had quietly tactfully never questioned, was Miriel Thorne. Elara watched from the second-floor window as her Aunt Cordelia, no, not her aunt. She reminded herself Miriel's late mother had been a distant Thorne cousin taken in by the Voss family out of an obligation dressed up as kindness. As this girl, who was not yet family, but soon would be, lifted her chin toward the manor's facade and smiled. It was not a villain's smile. It was soft, shy, achingly sympathetic, the exact expression of a grieving orphan grateful for shelter. Elara had seen that smile before. She had seen it across a courtroom, watching from a cage of accusations she could not escape, while Miriel dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief and told the tribunal in a voice trembling with sorrowful reluctance, "I loved my cousin. I did. But I cannot lie to protect her, not when so many people have been hurt." That smile had sent Elara to the gallows. And now it was aimed directly up at her window, as if Miriel already knew exactly which room Elara would be standing in, exactly which moment to look up and let their eyes meet for the very first time in this second, borrowed life. For one suspended heartbeat, something flickered behind Miriel's grief-softened eyes, something sharp, something that did not belong on the face of an 11-year-old girl freshly orphaned and thrown on the mercy of relatives she'd never met. Then it was gone, replaced by that same trembling, sympathetic smile, and Miriel Thorne raised one small gloved hand in a shy, hopeful wave, the wave of a lonely child hoping desperately to be loved. Elara did not wave back. She thought of a hairpin. She thought of a whispered spell overheard in a memory that did not belong to this body but belonged unmistakably to her soul. She thought of the words "nobody will ever suspect the villainess, that's the beauty of it," spoken in a voice she now recognized with sickening clarity. 6 years from this moment, unless she found a way to stop it, that girl in the courtyard would watch her hang and weep prettily while doing it, and every soul in the kingdom would call it justice. Elara pressed her palm flat against the cold window pane. "Not this time," she whispered, and for the first time in either of her lives, the words felt less like a wish and more like a war declared. Because if the world was determined to call her a villainess no matter what she did, then perhaps, Elara thought. Watching Miriel Thorne glide toward the manor's front steps with the practiced grace of a girl who had already somewhere somehow learned exactly how to be believed, perhaps it was time she learned to become the kind of villainess who was actually dangerous. Not to the innocent, to liars. 7 years passed the way water passes over stones slowly, and then all at once, wearing away everything Elara thought she understood about patience. She was 18 now, and she had spent those 7 years becoming someone the first version of her would not have recognized. She had learned to read faces the way scholars read old scripture, for what was hidden beneath the surface as much as what was written plainly across it. She had learned which servants gossiped, which lords drank too much at dinner and forgot themselves, which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with a secret, and which ones sold secrets like fruit at a market stall. And she had learned, with a precision that sometimes frightened her, exactly how Miriel Thorne operated. It was never obvious. That was the horror of it. Miriel did not scheme in shadows or cackle over poisoned chalices like the villains in the folk stories Ophelia used to tell. Miriel wept. Miriel worried aloud, gently, to exactly the right people, at exactly the right moments. Miriel had a gift, and Elara now understood it was not merely charm, but something closer to sorcery, for making the truth feel like a matter of opinion, and her own lies feel like reluctant, sorrowful facts. "I only mention it because I'm concerned," Miriel had said to Elara's mother just last month, her voice a perfect blend of hesitation and duty. "But I did see Elara arguing rather fiercely with Lady Priscilla at the tea salon. I'm sure it was nothing." Elara has always had such a temper, even as a little girl. I remember once she nearly struck a servant over a spilled cup. That last part was invented whole cloth. Elara had never struck a servant in her life. Not once, not even in the version of events where the entire kingdom believed her capable of murder. But by the time Miriel finished speaking, Elara watched her own mother's face do the thing it always did now, a small, tired flicker of doubt, quickly smoothed over, quickly forgiven, because after all, Miriel only mentioned it out of concern. That was the true weapon, not poison. Not blades, doubt delivered so gently it never even felt like an attack. Elara had tried in the early years of this second life to fight doubt with the truth. She had told her mother plainly once that she suspected Miriel of manipulating people's memories and perceptions, that she believed her cousin possessed some manner of cursed artifact, likely the ornate silver hairpin Miriel never removed even to sleep. Her mother had looked at her with such pained, quiet disappointment that Elara understood in that moment precisely what jealousy looked like when it was mistaken for madness. She lost her mother, Elara, her mother had said. The least you could do is show her some compassion instead of these accusations. Elara had learned her lesson. The truth, unsupported, was worthless. Worse than worthless, it made her sound exactly like the paranoid, vindictive villainess the kingdom would later condemn her as. If she wanted anyone to believe her, she would need proof so undeniable that Miriel's honeyed voice could not talk her way around it. So Elara had stopped accusing. She had started collecting. Every incident where Miriel's story didn't quite match the timeline, Elara wrote down in a cipher only she could read, hidden inside the false bottom of her jewelry box. Every servant Miriel had quietly dismissed for unreliability. Always, Elara noticed, servants who had seen something they shouldn't have, she tracked down and paid, generously and anonymously, to disappear somewhere safe rather than somewhere convenient for Miriel. Every whispered rumor that mysteriously began circulating about Elara's cruelty, her instability, her temper, she traced backward like a hunter following a bloodhound's nose, and every single trail, without exception, led back to a conversation Miriel had innocently had with someone 2 days prior. It was exhausting. It was lonely. And worst of all, it was working exactly as Miriel intended. Because the more carefully Elara watched her cousin, the more withdrawn and suspicious she appeared to everyone else, and the more withdrawn and suspicious she appeared, the more perfectly she fit the role Miriel had been quietly writing for her since the day she arrived. "You should smile more," her father told her once, not unkindly, but with the weary tone of a man who did not understand why his daughter had become so cold. Miriel smiles, people like Miriel. People like Miriel because Miriel has spent 7 years teaching them to. Elara wanted to scream. Instead, she smiled a thin, careful smile and said nothing at all because she had learned that too. Saying nothing was safer than saying something true and being disbelieved for it. It was on a rain-soaked evening in early autumn during the betrothal ball for Lord Cashin Farrow, the second son of Valcrest's most powerful ducal house, and a man Elara remembered in her first life only as a cold and distant stranger who had testified against her character at her trial, that everything shifted. Elara had come to the ball with no expectations beyond enduring it. She stood near the edge of the great hall, half hidden by a marble column, watching Miriel work the room the way a spider works a web, drifting from cluster to cluster of nobility, laughing at exactly the right jokes, touching exactly the right forearms, leaving behind her a soft trail of borrowed warmth that made everyone she spoke to feel, however briefly, like the most important person in Valcrest. "You're staring rather intently at Lady Thorne," said a low, unfamiliar voice beside her. Elara turned, startled, into the steady gray gaze of a man she hadn't heard approach, tall, dark-haired, dressed in the deep navy of House Farrow, with an expression that gave away nothing at all. Cashin. In her first life, this man's testimony had been one nail in her coffin. He had told the tribunal with cool detachment that he had once witnessed Lady Elara Voss speak to a servant with unwarranted cruelty. Elara had never forgotten the sentence, because she had never once in either life spoken cruelly to a servant, but by then no denial mattered. "I was admiring her gown," Elara said flatly. "You weren't." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You were watching how she moves through a room like a woman studying an opponent." Elara's pulse spiked. She kept her face perfectly still, a skill 7 hard years in the making. "That's a strange thing to say to someone you've never spoken to before, my lord." "I've spoken to you before," Cashin said. "You simply don't remember." The words landed like a struck bell, ringing through her chest with a resonance that had nothing to do with tone and everything to do with impossible, terrible possibility. "I beg your pardon." Cashin studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his composed gray eyes, calculation perhaps, or its opposite, recognition. 3 years ago, a garden party at the Ashworth estate. You told me, quite seriously, that Lady Thorne's silver hairpin gave you an uneasy feeling you couldn't explain. I thought it an odd, forgettable comment from a girl I'd exchanged perhaps 10 words with in my life. Elara's mouth went dry. She did not remember this conversation. She had never had it, not in this life, not yet, not for another 3 years by the timeline she was currently living. Which meant one of two things, and both of them made the floor feel suddenly, dangerously unsteady beneath her silk slippers. Either Cashin Farrow was lying to her for reasons she couldn't begin to guess, Or somewhere somehow, there was another version of this conversation still waiting to happen, one Elara had not yet lived, spoken by a version of herself she had not yet become, in a future that had not yet arrived. "That's impossible," she said quietly. "We've never spoken before tonight." Cashin's gray eyes did not waver. "I know," he said. "That's precisely why I've been waiting 3 years to see if you'd say it again." They found a quiet alcove away from the music, half hidden behind a curtain of imported silk, and Elara realized her hands were trembling only when she folded them tightly together to make them stop. "Explain yourself," she said, "or I will assume you're either drunk or cruel, and I have very little patience for either." Something almost like admiration crossed Cashin's face. "Fair enough." He glanced once around the alcove, confirming they were unobserved, then lowered his voice. 6 years from now, you are executed in the central square of Valcrest for a string of crimes I do not believe you committed. The room seemed to tilt. "How?" Elara whispered. "Do you know that?" "Because I watched it happen." Cashin's jaw tightened, the only crack in his otherwise flawless composure. "I was 26 years old. I stood in the crowd because my father insisted House Pharaoh show its face at state executions, a show of loyalty to the crown. I watched you climb the platform. I watched you laugh this strange, awful laugh right before the end. And I remember thinking even then that it did not sound like the laugh of a guilty woman." "That's not possible," Elara said, though every word out of his mouth matched with sickening precision the last memory of her first life. "You would have been a child. I was a child. And then I closed my eyes the night after your execution, certain I would never sleep peacefully again, and when I opened them I was 11 years old, standing in my father's stable yard 7 years in the past." He held her gaze, steady and unblinking. "I have lived these 7 years twice now, Lady Voss. The first time I did nothing. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in Voss family matters, that surely the tribunal wouldn't condemn an innocent woman, that surely someone closer to you would notice what I noticed and intervene before it was too late. No one did. So I decided if I ever found myself here again, I would not make that mistake twice." Elara stared at him, and something long frozen inside her chest, some small, exhausted part of her that had spent 7 years absolutely certain she was fighting this war entirely alone, cracked audibly open. "You said you spoke to me 3 years from now," she said slowly. "At a garden party about the hairpin. I did in my first version of these years." A muscle worked in his jaw. "But this is not that version anymore. The moment I approached you tonight, 3 years before I ever did the first time, I changed something. I don't know how much. I don't know if the future I remember is still the one coming for us, or if we've already stepped off that road entirely." He exhaled, something raw bleeding briefly through his composure. "I've been waiting 7 years to find out if you remembered too. Tonight, watching you watch Lady Thorne the way a soldier watches a battlefield, I finally let myself hope." "Why?" Elara asked, throat tight. "Why does it matter to you? In your first life you barely knew me, you testified against me at the tribunal." Something flickered across his face, guilt, unmistakable and raw. "I know, I've had 7 years to hate myself for that sentence. It was true as far as I understood truth at the time. I did witness what I described. A servant girl weeping, telling me in half the ballroom that Lady Voss had spoken to her cruelly in the kitchens. I believed her. I had no reason not to." His eyes met Elara's, dark with something like an apology, 7 years too late to matter, and yet somehow mattering more than anything. "It wasn't until years later, lying awake after your death, that I made myself actually remember that girl's face. The way she glanced sideways once at someone standing just out of my line of sight, as though checking whether her performance was convincing enough. I never saw who she was looking at, but I've thought about that glance every single day since." Elara closed her eyes. When she opened them, her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Miriel, I believe so. I can't prove it, not yet." Cashin's expression sharpened into something colder, something that looked less like grief now and more like purpose. "But I intend to." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The music drifted faintly from the ballroom, beyond the curtain, absurdly cheerful against the weight of what had just passed between them. Two strangers bound by a death neither of them had managed to prevent the first time. Standing in the wreckage of a future they were both now determined to burn to the ground and rebuild. "I've spent 7 years collecting evidence," Elara finally said. "Timelines, testimonies, every dismissed servant, every convenient rumor, every incident where her story didn't quite fit the facts. I have more proof against Miriel Thorne than the Crown Tribunal ever bothered to gather against me, but it isn't enough. Not against a girl the entire kingdom has decided to love. Then we need something undeniable," Cashin said, "something that doesn't rely on anyone's word against hers. Something physical. The hairpin," he agreed. You said in the future I remember that it gave you an uneasy feeling. I've watched her for years now and I've noticed the same thing you clearly have, she never removes it. Not for sleep, not for bathing, not even, according to her lady's maid, for the fever she suffered 2 winters ago that nearly killed her. A woman does not cling to a piece of jewelry that desperately unless it is far more than jewelry. Elara thought of the memory that did not belong to her, the whispered spell, the words nobody will ever suspect the villainess. She had assumed for 7 years that it was simply a memory of overheard scheming. But watching Cashin's face now, turning the pieces over with the sharp, methodical focus of a man who had spent 7 years quietly investigating a murder that hadn't happened yet, she wondered, for the first time, if it had been something else entirely. I think it's cursed, she said slowly. Or enchanted, I think it lets her, I don't know how to explain it, plant memories. Make people believe things happened that never did or forget things that did, that servant girl who accused me. I'd wager everything I own that girl genuinely believes to this day that I was cruel to her, not because she's lying, because Miriel made her believe it. Cashin went very still. That would explain a great deal, he said quietly. My own father speaks of you sometimes with a dislike he's never once explained when I've asked him directly, as though the feeling exists in him without any memory attached to justify it. If I'm right, Elara said, then we're not fighting a clever liar. We're fighting something far harder to defeat, a girl who can rewrite the truth itself, one whispered conversation at a time. She met his eyes, and for the first time in 7 long years of carrying this alone, she felt something dangerously close to hope. Which means the only weapon that will ever work against her is one she can't talk her way around. Proof, Cashin said. Proof, Elara agreed, and I think I finally know how to get it. Outside the alcove the music swelled toward its final movement. And somewhere across the crowded ballroom Miriel Thorne laughed her bright breaking-glass laugh at something a young lord had said utterly unaware, that for the first time since her arrival at Voss Manor 7 years ago. 2 people in this kingdom had finally begun looking at her exactly the way she deserved to be looked at, not as a grieving orphan, as a suspect. Building a trap for a girl who could rewrite memory itself required a different kind of weapon than either of them had first assumed. And it took the better part of a month for Elara and Cashin to agree on what that weapon should be. We cannot simply steal the hairpin, Cashin said, pacing the length of his study while rain lashed the windows outside. They had taken to meeting here, in the guise of a courtship neither of their families discouraged. A convenient cover that had somewhere in the past 4 weeks stopped feeling entirely like a performance. If it truly holds some manner of enchantment, and we don't understand its nature, we risk breaking whatever spell it's cast on the people around her. Every falsified memory it's implanted could simply remain falsified forever, with no way to prove it was ever false to begin with. Then we need someone who understands enchantment, Elara said. Someone outside the nobility, someone Miriel has no reason to have already charmed. It was Ophelia, of all people, who provided the answer, the same nanny Elara had once believed murdered, now very much alive, and Elara had slowly discovered over the past 7 years, sharper and more observant than half the tribunal that would have one day condemned her. There's a woman in the lower quarter, Ophelia said one evening, helping Elara out of her formal gown with the same unhurried tenderness she'd shown since Elara was in swaddling clothes. Widow Callow. Used to serve the royal household before she was dismissed, some scandal, though no one quite remembers what, which strikes me now, my lady, as rather suspicious in itself, given what you've told me. She reads enchantment the way scholars read scripture. If that hairpin is more than jewelry, she'll know it on sight. Elara had told Ophelia everything, weeks ago, in a moment of exhausted vulnerability she hadn't entirely planned. She had expected disbelief. She had expected, at best, gentle humoring of a girl who'd clearly suffered some private grief no one understood. Instead, Ophelia had listened in silence, her weathered face growing paler and paler, and at the end had said only, I always wondered why I felt certain I'd once seen Lady Miriel slip something into your morning chocolate, and yet could never quite remember when or why. I never mentioned it to anyone. The realization had sat between them like a struck match, illuminating 7 years of small, unexplainable doubts neither of them had ever thought to connect. Widow Callow turned out to be a small, sharp-eyed woman who lived above a dye shop that smelled permanently of indigo, and who did not so much as blink when Elara, dressed plainly, hood-drawn low, Cashin waiting a discreet distance away, described the hairpin in careful, measured detail. Silver, you said. Wrought in a spiral with a small dark stone at the center, obsidian likely, or something imitating it. You know it, I know its kind. The widow's mouth thinned into something grim. Memory-binding artifacts were outlawed by royal decree 40 years ago, after a scandal involving a minor lordling who used one to convince half his household staff they'd witnessed his brother committing treason. Should have all been destroyed. Some clearly were not. She studied Elara with new, uncomfortable interest. If your cousin possesses a true memory binder and has been using it as long as you suspect, then understand this, girl, it does not simply implant false memories out of nothing. It requires a seed, a grain of something real to twist and grow around, however small. That's why the lies always feel plausible to the people she tells them to. Somewhere in every falsehood, there is a fragment of truth she's warping into a weapon. Then how do we stop her? You cannot pry a memory binder loose by force if that's what you're hoping. Try to steal it, and it will simply mark you as its next victim the moment your fingers close around it. You'll find your own memories rearranging to protect its wearer, without you even noticing the change. Widow Callow's sharp eyes narrowed further. But there is one weakness in objects such as these. They cannot rewrite a memory that has already been witnessed and recorded by more than one unbroken mind at the exact same moment. Independent, simultaneous witnesses, girl, that is the one truth a memory binder cannot touch, because it cannot be in every mind at once, altering every account to match. If enough people see the truth together at the same instant, before she has a chance to isolate and rework each of them individually afterward, the lie cannot take root. Elara felt something settle into place in her chest, cold and clear and finally actionable. We need Miriel to reveal herself, she said slowly, in front of witnesses she cannot separate and correct afterward. You need, Widow Callow corrected, to catch her using it. Not simply suspecting her of cruelty, or scheming, or lying, actually catch her, hairpin in hand, memory unraveling in real time, in front of enough eyes that she cannot silence or twist every single one before the truth spreads too far to contain. It was, Elara thought on the carriage ride home, both the simplest and most impossible task she had ever been given. Because Miriel never showed her hand. Not once, not in 7 years of watching. Whatever she did with that hairpin, she did it in whispered, private moments. A hand on someone's arm in an empty corridor. A quiet word exchanged while no one else was near enough to hear. She was careful in a way that suggested she, too, understood exactly how dangerous a public mistake would be. Which meant they would need to force one. They would need to give Miriel Thorne a target so tempting, so perfectly suited to her methods, that she would risk using her magic in front of people for the first time in 7 years, and they would need to be ready the instant she did to make certain the truth could not be unwritten afterward. There's a betrothal announcement planned for next month, Cashin said quietly, when Elara relayed everything to him that evening in his study, the rain finally settling into a soft, steady patter against the glass. My father intends to formally announce an arrangement between myself and Lady Priscilla Ashworth. It's been assumed for years, a political match, nothing more, though he's never bothered discussing it with me directly. Elara felt something twist unpleasantly in her chest that she chose, for now, not to examine too closely. What does that have to do with Miriel? Everything, Cashin said, if we let it be known quietly, carefully, to exactly the right ears that I intend to break the arrangement in favor of courting you instead. Understanding dawned slowly, and with it, a cold thread of unease. You think she'll try to stop it? I think, Cashin said, that a girl who has spent 7 years quietly, patiently arranging your downfall will not sit idle while you rise instead. Engaged to the son of one of Valcrest's most powerful houses, publicly vindicated, publicly loved. I think it will be the first time in this entire scheme that Miriel Thorne feels something she has never had to feel before. What's that? Cashin's gray eyes held hers, steady and certain. Urgency. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere across the city, in a manor house lit warm and golden against the storm, a girl with a silver hairpin and a smile like breaking glass was at that very moment hearing the first whispered rumor of a betrothal that threatened everything she had spent 7 patient years building, and beginning, for the first time, to make a mistake. The rumor spread exactly as Cashin predicted, quietly at first, a murmur among ladies' maids and stable hands, then louder, dressed up in the particular relish court gossip reserves for anything resembling scandal. By the second week, it had reached the ears it was always intended for. Elara watched the change in Miriel with the clinical attention of a physician monitoring a fever. It was subtle. Anyone not actively searching for it would have missed it entirely. The faintest tightness at the corners of Miriel's smile during afternoon tea, a half-second too long before she responded to a compliment about Elara's new blue gown, a habit newly formed of touching the silver hairpin at her temple whenever Cashin's name entered conversation, as though grounding herself against something. She's rattled, Ophelia reported one evening, having spent the past week cultivating a careful friendship with Miriel's ladies maid over shared complaints about aching feet and demanding mistresses. Snapped at the poor girl twice this week over nothing at all, a wrinkled dress, a cold cup of tea. Apologized both times, sweet as anything, blamed it on nerves about the upcoming season. But the girl says she's never seen her temper slip like that before. Not once in 3 years of service. 7 years of perfect, patient control, cracking at last under a single rumor of a betrothal she hadn't authored. Good, Elara murmured, though the word tasted strange in her mouth because some small, stubborn part of her, the part that remembered being 11 years old and desperately wanting a cousin, a friend, a sister who wasn't a lie, still ached at the sight of Miriel unraveling. She reminded herself firmly of the rope, of the platform, of the sound the crowd had made, that awful eager silence right before the drop. Compassion for Miriel Thorne was a luxury she had buried in a grave 7 years deep, and she did not intend to dig it back up now. The formal betrothal announcement was scheduled for the autumn harvest ball held in the Grand Hall of House Pharaoh, the same hall. Elara realized with grim irony, where the tribunal had once gathered witnesses to condemn her in a future, she was now systematically dismantling one careful move at a time. Widow Callow arrived 3 days before the ball, disguised as a seamstress's assistant brought in to make final adjustments to Elara's gown, and spent a full hour instructing her on what to do the instant, if Miriel's control finally broke. You cannot simply accuse her, the widow warned, pins clenched between her teeth as she worked the hem of Elara's midnight blue silk. If she reaches for that hairpin in a moment of panic and you're the only one who sees it clearly, she'll simply rewrite your accusation into something else entirely. Hysteria, jealousy, a jilted woman's cruelty toward her sweet, grieving cousin. You need witnesses who see the exact same thing at the exact same instant before she has any chance to touch a single one of their minds afterward. How many witnesses? As many as you can manage. And ideally, the widow added, fixing Elara with a sharp look, witnesses whose word cannot easily be dismissed. A servant's account can be quietly doubted, a duke's cannot. Cashin had already anticipated this. His father, Duke Pharaoh, a stern, exacting man Elara had spent months slowly, carefully earning the cautious respect of, had been informed days earlier of a concerning pattern regarding Lady Thorne's conduct, framed carefully enough to pique suspicion without revealing the full, unbelievable truth. The Duke had agreed, with the weary skepticism of a man humoring his son, to observe the harvest ball closely. Elara's own parents would be present. Lady Priscilla Ashworth, the woman Cashin was publicly dramatically abandoning at the altar of expectation, would be present too. And though Elara had initially worried about her reaction, a private conversation weeks earlier had revealed Priscilla harbored no romantic feelings toward Cashin whatsoever, and considerable curiosity about why Elara Voss of all people had suddenly become so interesting. I don't need you to fall in love with him, Priscilla had said, amused over tea. I need you to survive whatever it is you're clearly planning, because you've had the look of a woman preparing for war for the past month. And frankly, my lady, it's the most entertaining thing to happen at court in years. By the night of the ball, everything was in place. Elara stood at the top of the grand staircase in her midnight blue gown, Cashin waiting at the bottom with an expression of careful public devotion that she was beginning to suspect was not entirely a performance. And somewhere in the glittering crowd below, Miriel Thorne stood very still, her silver hairpin catching the candlelight, watching the two of them, with an expression that had for just one unguarded instant stopped pretending to be soft. The announcement came at the height of the evening, Duke Pharaoh's voice carrying across the hushed grand hall with the weight of long tradition, a formal recognition of Cashin's intent to court Lady Elara Voss, spoken in front of 200 witnesses drawn from every noble house in Valcrest. The applause was polite, measured, the kind reserved for news that was technically scandalous, and then Miriel Thorne moved. Elara saw it happen in fragments the way one remembers trauma, Miriel crossing the floor with a speed that shattered her usual practiced grace. Reaching Elara's side, just as the crowd began to disperse into smaller conversational clusters, her hand closing around Elara's wrist, with a grip that left crescents in the skin. A word, cousin, Miriel said, her voice pitched low, sweet, perfectly calibrated for anyone glancing their way to hear nothing but affectionate urgency. Just a moment, please. She pulled Elara toward the terrace doors, and Elara let herself be pulled, heart-hammering, every nerve screaming at her to look for Cashin, for Widow Callow, for anyone positioned to witness what she suspected with sick certainty was about to happen. The terrace was empty. Cold night air bit through the thin silk of Elara's gown as the doors swung shut behind them, sealing out the music, the light, the 200 witnesses who might have seen. Miriel released her wrist and stepped back. And for the first time in 7 years in either lifetime, Elara watched her cousin's face fall completely still. The grief-softened mask sliding away to reveal something underneath that was cold and calculating and utterly chillingly awake. "You remember," Miriel said quietly, not a question. "I've suspected for months the way you watch me now. You never used to watch me like that, not until recently. You remember something you shouldn't." Elara's blood went to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about. Don't." Miriel's hand rose to the silver hairpin at her temple, fingers curling around it with the same possessive tenderness a mother might show a child. "I have spent 7 years perfecting this, cousin. 7 years learning exactly what people are willing to believe and exactly how gently you have to guide them there. I am not going to let some half-remembered nightmare undo all of it now. What are you going to do?" Elara's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough to hurt. "Rewrite my memory too, make me forget everything I know." Something almost like regret flickered across Miriel's face. There, and gone, so fast Elara nearly convinced herself she'd imagined it. "I'd hoped it wouldn't come to that," Miriel said softly, and drew the hairpin free from her hair in one smooth motion, the small obsidian stone at its center catching the moonlight like a drop of captured shadow. "But you've left me very little choice, haven't you, cousin?" Behind them, the terrace doors swung open and Miriel, mid-motion, hairpin raised, froze, because standing in the doorway, illuminated by the golden light spilling out from the ballroom behind them, were not 1 or 2 witnesses. There were 7. Cashin, Duke Pharaoh, his expression thunderous with dawning understanding. Elara's own mother and father, faces drained of color. Widow Callow, disguised still in her seamstress's plain gray dress, watching with the sharp, satisfied focus of a hunter whose trap had finally perfectly closed. Lady Priscilla, hand pressed to her mouth in genuine, unrehearsed shock. And Ophelia, tears already tracking silently down her weathered cheeks. 7 witnesses. 7 unbroken minds, watching the exact same impossible truth unfold in the exact same instant. Miriel Thorne stood frozen on the moonlit terrace, hairpin raised, mask shattered, and for the first time in 7 patient, perfect years had absolutely nowhere left to hide. For a long moment, no one on the terrace moved. The night wind stirred the hem of Miriel's gown, and somewhere behind the frozen tableau, the ballroom orchestra continued playing, oblivious, a cheerful counterpoint to the silence stretching taut enough to snap. It was Duke Pharaoh who broke it, his voice carrying the particular cold fury of a man who has just watched a lifetime of unexplained certainties suddenly, sickeningly explained. "Put it down," he said, "or I will have the guards remove it from your hand by force, Lady Thorne, and I promise you the process will not be gentle." Miriel's eyes darted between the 7 faces surrounding her, searching, Elara realized with cold understanding, for any crack she might exploit, any single mind she might still reach and rewrite before the others compared notes. But there were too many. Too many eyes, too many separate accounts already forming in 7 separate minds, each one a witness the others could corroborate. Widow Callow's warning echoed in Elara's memory. It cannot be in every mind at once, altering every account to match. If enough people see the truth together at the same instant, the lie cannot take root. Slowly, deliberately, Miriel lowered the hairpin, but she did not release it. "You don't understand," she said, and her voice had changed, the sweet, trembling softness gone, replaced by something raw and exhausted, a girl who had been performing for so long she seemed almost relieved to finally stop. "None of you understand what it was like. Do you know what happens to a penniless cousin in this world? Do you know what happens to a girl whose only value to her relations is the small, grudging kindness they can afford to show her before it becomes inconvenient?" "That does not excuse," Elara's mother began, but Miriel's laugh cut her off, brittle and bitter. "Excuse? I'm not asking for an excuse. I stopped needing your understanding a long time ago." Her gaze fixed on Elara, and something old and wounded moved behind her eyes, the first genuinely unguarded thing Elara had seen from her cousin in either lifetime. "You had everything, Elara. A mother who worried over you even when she doubted you. A father who provided for you without ever once making you feel like a debt he was reluctantly repaying. A nanny who loved you enough to hum you to sleep. I had none of that. I had a mother who drank herself into an early grave and relatives who took me in purely to avoid the scandal of turning away a dead woman's orphan child." "That still doesn't explain the hairpin," Cashin said quietly. "Where did you get an artifact outlawed for 40 years? Miriel's mouth curved, humorless. "My mother's last gift to me. The only thing of value she left behind, hidden in the lining of an old traveling case, along with a letter explaining exactly what it did and exactly how to use it. She'd used it herself once, to convince my father's family to accept their marriage all those years ago, when they'd wanted nothing to do with a woman of her station. It worked beautifully for her, right up until the day it didn't, and she spent the rest of her life drinking away the guilt of a marriage built on a memory that was never truly freely given. And you decided to use it anyway, Elara said, knowing what it had already cost her. I decided, Miriel said, and here the exhaustion in her voice sharpened into something colder, something closer to conviction, that I would rather be feared than pitied. I arrived at Voss Manor 11 years old with nothing, and I watched how this family looked at me, kind enough on the surface, but underneath, always calculating exactly how much of their resources a stray relation was worth. I understood very quickly that kindness in this world is conditional, and gratitude is a debt that never stops accruing interest. So I decided to stop being grateful. I decided to make myself necessary instead, beloved, indispensable, the sweet cousin everyone adored, while you, her eyes cut to Elara, sharp and glittering, became the convenient shadow I needed you to be. It was never personal, Elara. I promise you that much is true. I simply needed someone to be the villain, and you were standing closest when I needed one. The casualness of it, the sheer, offhand cruelty of I simply needed someone to be the villain, struck Elara harder than any confession of malice could have. Because it confirmed something she had suspected for 7 years and never quite let herself fully believe. That none of it, not the dead mare, not the poisoned ant, not the years of quiet, corrosive doubt planted in her own parents' eyes, had ever been about hatred. It had simply been convenient. The mare, Elara said, her voice shaking now despite every effort to keep it steady. Willow, you had her throat cut and left my gloves beside the body when I was 11 years old. That was convenient too. Something flickered across Miriel's face, not quite guilt, but close enough to its shadow. I needed the household to believe you capable of cruelty from the very beginning. A reputation built early is a reputation that calcifies. By the time you were old enough to defend yourself, everyone already knew, deep in whatever part of their mind the hairpin had touched, exactly what kind of girl you were. She paused. I am not proud of it, but I am not sorry for it either. Survival rarely leaves room for both. And my Aunt Cordelia, Elara's mother's voice cracked on the name, her own sister, dead 6 years now in Elara's original timeline from what the family had quietly, tragically called a wasting illness. Was that convenient too? For the first time, Miriel hesitated. She discovered the hairpin, Miriel said finally, quietly. 3 years ago, she confronted me privately, threatened to expose everything to the family unless I destroyed it. I panicked. I never meant for the tonic to, she stopped herself, but the admission hung in the frozen night air regardless. Unmistakable, unretractable, spoken in front of 7 witnesses who would carry it, unaltered, into whatever came next. Elara's mother made a sound like something breaking. That's a confession, Duke Pharaoh said grimly. Murder, Lady Thorne, not manipulation, not survival. Murder spoken freely in front of witnesses whose testimony you can no longer touch. Miriel's composure, already fractured, finally fully shattered. Her hand tightened around the hairpin until her knuckles whitened, and for one terrible instant, Elara thought she might turn it on all of them at once. A desperate, doomed attempt to rewrite 7 minds simultaneously rather than surrender to what was coming. Miriel, Elara said, and something in her own voice surprised her, not triumph, not the cold satisfaction she'd imagined feeling for 7 long years of planning this exact moment, but something closer to sorrow. It's over, put it down. Whatever comes next, you'll survive it more easily with your hands empty than with them full. For a long suspended moment, golden ballroom light spilling across the terrace stones between them. Elara watched her cousin's face war with itself, the girl who had spent 7 years perfecting a mask of grief and sweetness, and beneath it the girl who had genuinely desperately never wanted to be anyone's villain either. Only history's convenient scapegoat had already been claimed by someone else first, and there had only ever been room in this family's story for one. Then Miriel Thorne's shoulders sagged, and the silver hairpin slipped from her fingers and struck the terrace stones with a small, bright, almost musical sound that Elara suspected she would remember, in whatever life came after this one, for the rest of her days. The hairpin lay on the terrace stones for what felt like a very long time before anyone moved to touch it. It was Widow Callow, finally, who stepped forward, producing a small square of white cloth from her seamstress's apron and lifting the artifact with the careful, reverent caution of a woman handling something that might still bite. It will need to be properly contained, she said, wrapping it swiftly, before it can be safely destroyed. Not tonight, not by untrained hands. Miriel had sunk to sit on the low terrace balustrade, all the fight gone out of her, staring at nothing with the hollow expression of a woman who had spent 7 years running and had finally, exhaustingly, stopped. The guards came within minutes, Duke Pharaoh's authority moving faster than gossip. For once, though, Elara knew that would not last. By morning, the entire kingdom would know some version of what had happened on this terrace, and Elara understood, with the weary clarity of someone who had already lived one version of public condemnation, that the coming weeks would not be simple. They were not simple. The tribunal convened 3 weeks later. The same tribunal chamber Elara remembered from her first life with a clarity that made her hands shake every time she crossed its threshold. The same high vaulted ceilings. The same rows of noble faces arranged to judge and be seen judging. Except this time, Elara did not stand in the accused's dock. Miriel did. The prosecution built its case methodically over 4 days of testimony. Widow Callow's expert account of memory-binding artifacts, and their outlawed history Duke Pharaoh's unshakable testimony as a witness of noble standing. The trembling but resolute statements of 3 separate former servants Elara had spent 7 years quietly protecting, each of them describing in their own words moments of inexplicable certainty about Elara's cruelty that had simply mysteriously evaporated the instant the hairpin was confiscated and contained. "I don't understand it," one servant girl said, weeping openly on the stand, the very same girl whose accusation had in Elara's first life been one of the nails driven into her coffin. "I remember being certain. I remember the feeling of it like a fact I'd always known. And now I try to recall a single specific moment, a single conversation, a single thing Lady Voss actually did or said to me, and there's nothing there. Just the certainty with nothing underneath it holding it up." It was Elara thought. Watching from the gallery beside her mother, the most honest and damning testimony of the entire trial. Because it proved more thoroughly than any confession could exactly what Miriel's magic had done to an entire household of decent people who had genuinely believed with their whole hearts. In a cruelty that had never existed, Miriel did not deny any of it. She sat through 4 days of testimony with a stillness that unsettled Elara more than any outburst could have, and when finally called to speak in her own defense, she offered none. "I did what I believed I needed to do to survive," she said simply, to a chamber gone utterly silent. "I am not going to insult this tribunal by pretending otherwise now. When pretending has already cost my cousin 7 years of a life she should never have had to fight this hard to reclaim." Her eyes found Elara's briefly across the crowded chamber, and in them, Elara saw not defiance but something closer to release. "I would ask only one mercy of this court, not for myself. For my mother's memory, and for whatever remains of the girl I might have become, in a life where I hadn't needed to become this instead." The tribunal deliberated for 2 days. Elara spent them at Voss Manor unable to settle to any single task. Wandering between the garden where this second life had begun and the stables where Willow, old now gentle, utterly unaware of how close she had once come to becoming a murder weapon in someone else's careful scheme, nosed contentedly at her palm for apples. "You look like a woman who hasn't slept in days," Cashin said, finding her there on the second evening, his own composure looking distinctly frayed at the edges after a week of testifying, negotiating, and fending off his father's pointed questions about the exact nature of his and Elara's courtship. "I keep thinking," Elara admitted, "that I should feel triumphant. 7 years, Cashin, 7 years of planning, watching, collecting proof one careful piece at a time, and now it's done and all I feel is tired." She pressed her forehead briefly against Willow's warm neck, the same gesture she'd made on the first day of this second life, 7 years and a lifetime of grief ago. "I keep thinking about what she said, about only ever needing someone to be the villain. About how she and I were never really enemies at all, just 2 girls this family failed in different ways, and only one of us was given a name for our suffering that let anyone forgive it." "That doesn't excuse what she did," Cashin said quietly. "No," Elara agreed. "It doesn't. She murdered my aunt. She would have let me hang for crimes I never committed and felt, I think, genuinely justified in doing it. I'm not asking you to forgive her or asking myself to either." She turned to face him fully, the last of the evening light gilding the stable yard gold. "I'm only saying that understanding why someone becomes a monster doesn't require you to excuse the monster they became. It just means you walk away from the whole story a little sadder than you expected to, even when you've won." Cashin was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression she was beginning to recognize. The look of a man who had spent 7 years alone with a secret too large to share with anyone, and had finally in her found someone who understood its exact weight without needing it explained. "For what it's worth," he said, "I don't think that sadness makes you weak. I think it's the only proof left that whatever this family did to both of you, it never quite managed to make you cruel in return. Miriel became what she believed she had to become to survive. You had every reason to become the same thing, and 7 years of watching you, Elara, I've never once seen you choose it." The tribunal's verdict arrived the following morning, delivered in the flat, formal language of law that could not begin to contain the weight of everything it settled and everything it left unresolved. Lady Miriel Thorne found guilty of the murder of Lady Cordelia Voss, of the use of an outlawed memory-binding artifact against numerous victims across 7 years, and of conspiracy to falsely condemn Lady Elara Voss, sentenced to permanent exile beyond Valcrest's borders, stripped of title and inheritance, forbidden ever to return. Not the execution Elara might once have wanted in the rawest, angriest hours of her first life's final days. Something else instead, something that felt. Standing in the tribunal chamber and watching Miriel led away in chains toward a ship that would carry her beyond the borders of everything she'd ever schemed to belong to, less like vengeance and more like justice. The strange, bittersweet kind that leaves no one entirely victorious. But as Elara watched her cousin's back disappear through the chamber doors for what she suspected would be the last time in either lifetime, she felt something else settle in her chest, quiet and unmistakable, that she hadn't expected to feel at all. Relief. Not because Miriel was gone, because, for the first time since she had opened her eyes as an 11-year-old girl, in a garden that smelled of wet stone and crushed mint, Elara Voss finally fully believed that the rest of this life, however long it lasted, whatever it held, was going to be entirely her own to write. Verdicts, Elara learned in the weeks that followed, were far easier to deliver than to believe. The tribunal had spoken. The hairpin had been formally contained and marked for destruction under royal seal. Miriel Thorne was gone, exiled beyond Valcrest's borders on a ship that had sailed a fortnight ago and would not return. By every legal measure, Elara Voss stood entirely, officially vindicated. And yet, "They still look at me the same way," Elara admitted to Ophelia one gray morning, watching from the sitting room window as 2 ladies from a neighboring estate passed the manor gates without pausing to call, as they once might have. Politely, carefully. Like they haven't quite decided whether the story they spent 7 years believing about me can really be entirely untrue, verdict or no verdict. 7 years of gossip doesn't unravel in 3 weeks, my lady, Ophelia said, not unkindly. Give it time. Elara understood the wisdom in that, even as impatience gnawed at her. She had spent 7 years being quietly, methodically doubted, watched every misstep magnified, every private grief reframed as evidence of some hidden cruelty. Now that the truth had finally, undeniably surfaced, some stubborn part of her had expected the world to simply, instantly correct itself, as though justice were a debt that settled the moment it was proven owed. Instead, the correction came slowly, awkwardly, in fits and starts. An invitation here, a warmer greeting there, the gradual thaw of a court that had built an entire understanding of her around a lie and now had to rebuild it brick by uncomfortable brick around something closer to truth. It was Duke Pharaoh, unexpectedly, who did the most to accelerate it. The man who had once regarded Elara with unexplained hairpin-planted dislike now made a point of publicly, deliberately favoring her, seating her at his right hand during a state dinner, honoring visiting dignitaries from the northern provinces. Praising her composure under the tribunal's scrutiny to anyone within earshot, a gruff, formidable man, converting 7 years of unwitting prejudice into equally stubborn advocacy. "I owe you an apology I can't fully make," he told her privately during a quiet moment at that same dinner. "Because I genuinely don't remember what I believed about you before that hairpin was removed from this kingdom, only that I believed it strongly enough to encourage my son toward Lady Ashworth, instead of you, for reasons I could never quite articulate even to myself. That should trouble me more than it does, I think. That a person's whole opinion of another human being can be built and dismantled by a piece of enchanted silver, and the person holding the opinion never even notices the hand doing the building. It troubles me too," Elara admitted, "more than I know how to say." "Then let us agree," the Duke said, "to notice it going forward, both of us. It seems the least owed to the years it cost you. But not every doubt dissolves so gracefully." 3 weeks after the verdict, a fresh rumor began circulating through the lower quarters of court society. Quiet, careful, deniable, in the exact same register Miriel herself had once used so expertly. Whispers that the tribunal's ruling had been rushed. That Duke Pharaoh's obvious favoritism toward his son's intended bride suggested the whole affair had been staged, somehow, for political advantage. That Lady Elara Voss, whatever the official record now claimed, had a temper. Everyone remembered that much, didn't they, even if the specific incidents had grown strangely hazy? And perhaps the real story was more complicated than the tribunal's convenient, tidy verdict suggested. Elara traced the rumor's origin with the same patient, methodical care she'd once applied to tracking Miriel's manipulations, and found, to her genuine surprise, that it led not to any lingering accomplice of her cousin's, but to something far more mundane and in its own way more troubling. It led to fear. People don't like admitting they were wrong, Widow Callow explained, when Elara sought her out again in the small indigo-scented rooms above the dye shop, seeking some enchanted explanation for a phenomenon that ultimately required none. Especially when being wrong meant participating, even passively, in the slow destruction of an innocent person's reputation. It's far more comfortable to believe the truth was more complicated than it actually was, than to sit with the plain, uncomfortable fact that an entire kingdom's worth of decent people helped condemn a young woman based on nothing sturdier than a feeling they never once thought to question. The widow's sharp eyes softened just slightly. That rumor isn't really about you anymore, girl. It's about them and what they can't quite forgive themselves for yet. The insight settled something in Elara that had been clenched tight since the verdict, a bitter, exhausted anger she hadn't fully acknowledged carrying. Because Widow Callow was right. This new doubt wasn't Miriel's hairpin reaching across an ocean to plant fresh lies. It was simply human nature, ordinary and unenchanted, protecting itself the only way it knew how, by making the victim's vindication feel less absolute than it actually was, so the surrounding guilt could feel less absolute too. Understanding it didn't erase the sting. But it did slowly teach her something she suspected she would carry for the rest of whatever life remained to her. That surviving injustice was rarely a single triumphant moment where the truth broke through and everything after unfolded easily. More often it was this instead, a long, uneven unwinding met with as much stubborn grace as a person could manage, one quiet correction and one earned trust at a time. She began attending events again, not with the guarded, watchful caution of the previous 7 years, but deliberately, visibly, present in rooms where her presence had once been merely tolerated. She spoke plainly when spoken to decline to perform either gratitude or defensiveness for anyone's comfort. And let the accumulating weight of ordinary unremarkable days, no scandal, no cruelty, simply a woman living her life without incident week after week after week, do the slow work that no single tribunal verdict ever could. It was, she found, its own quiet kind of revenge. Not against any one person, against the entire shape of the story that had once tried to consume her. Cashin, for his part, remained steadily, publicly at her side throughout, not shielding her from the discomfort exactly but simply present in it. A visible and unwavering counterweight to every hesitant whisper that suggested her vindication might be less than complete. "You don't have to keep doing this," Elara told him one evening, after a particularly frosty garden party where 3 separate ladies had found excuses to avoid direct conversation with her. "Standing beside me through all of this. I know what it costs your family's standing, having your name so publicly tangled up in mine while half the court still isn't sure what to make of me." Cashin's expression, when he turned to her, held none of the calculated composure she'd first met on a rain-soaked terrace 7 weeks ago. Just something plain and steady and entirely unguarded. "I spent an entire lifetime watching you die for a crime you didn't commit, and telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere," he said. "I am done, Elara, deciding what is and isn't my place where you're concerned. I intend to stand beside you through every frosty garden party this kingdom can produce, for as many years as you'll allow it, and I would consider it the great privilege of both my lives." Somewhere above them, the last of the evening light was fading into the soft violet of early autumn dusk, and Elara Voss, 11 years past a garden that smelled of wet stone, 7 years past a rope she had once believed inevitable, found herself for the first time in either lifetime. Uncertain what to say and entirely unafraid of the silence that followed instead. The letter arrived on a morning otherwise unremarkable, tucked among the usual correspondence of invitations and pleasantries, addressed in a hand Elara did not recognize and sealed with wax bearing no crest at all. She almost dismissed it as an anonymous crank. Court society produced its share of those, particularly in the aftermath of a scandal as thoroughly whispered about as hers had been. But something in the weight of the paper, the careful, deliberate strokes of the address, made her open it instead of consigning it to the fire. "Lady Voss, you believe the matter concluded. I write only to correct a misapprehension that may prove costly if left uncorrected. The hairpin your cousin carried was not her mother's sole invention, nor her mother's alone to have discovered. Such artifacts are crafted, not found, and the one who taught Miriel's mother their making is very much still active in matters of Valcrest's court, and was, until recently, rather pleased with how quietly your family's misfortune served certain larger purposes. I do not write out of any loyalty to your cousin, who exceeded her instructions considerably and paid the appropriate price for it. I write because the ship that carried her into exile did not, in fact, reach its intended port, And I suspect you would prefer to hear that from me rather than discover it, considerably less pleasantly, on your own. A friend of sorts. Elara read the letter 3 times before the full weight of it settled into her stomach like a stone. She brought it to Cashin within the hour, and watched his face darken with the same cold understanding that had gripped her own. Someone taught Miriel's mother how to craft memory-binding artifacts, he said slowly. Someone who considered our family's misfortune useful to some larger purpose, and now that same someone claims Miriel never reached exile at all. If she's dead, Elara said, then whoever wrote this has no reason to warn me unless they want something from me in return. Or unless, Cashin said grimly, they want you frightened enough to make a mistake. They brought the letter to Widow Callow that same afternoon and watched her sharp, weathered face grow graver with every line. Memory binders were not always outlawed, the widow said quietly once she'd finished reading. 40 years ago, before the royal decree, they were a quiet specialty among certain court factions who found the ability to shape a rival's perception rather more useful than any blade. The decree drove the practice underground. It did not, I fear, eliminate it. She set the letter down with visible reluctance, as though it might still bite. If someone taught Cordelia Thorne's daughter to wield such a thing, and considered your family's suffering merely a useful byproduct of some larger design, then I fear Miriel Thorne was never the true architect of your downfall at all, my lady. Merely its most visible instrument. Then who, Elara asked, was the architect? It took another careful month of quiet inquiry. Widow Cal, tracing old rumors of the outlawed practice through contacts, Elara didn't ask too many questions about Cashin leveraging his father's standing to request discreet records from the royal archive. Elara herself revisiting 7 years of collected observations with fresh painful attention, before the pattern finally sickeningly emerged. It led improbably, and yet with a kind of dreadful inevitability once seen clearly, to Lord Haldon Grey, a mild, unremarkable court advisor who had served 3 successive monarchs with a reputation for careful discretion and unshakable loyalty, and who had, Elara now realized, been present quietly, unobtrusively, at the edges of nearly every significant moment of her downfall in her first life. A whispered word to the tribunal here, a carefully placed doubt in a minister's ear there, never visible enough to suspect, never absent enough to be coincidence once you knew to look. Why, Elara asked, staring at the modest dossier Widow Callow had assembled, would a court advisor care whether one minor noble family destroyed itself over a dead horse and a poisoned ant? Perhaps he didn't particularly, Cashin said slowly, working through the logic aloud. Perhaps House Voss was never the true target at all. Perhaps we were simply convenient, a minor house whose destruction could be engineered quietly as practice or as demonstration for something considerably larger he intended to attempt elsewhere. A proof of concept dressed up as a family tragedy. The thought was so coldly practical, so devoid of any personal malice at all, that Elara found it somehow more disturbing than anything Miriel had confessed on that moonlit terrace. Miriel, at least, had hated her circumstances enough to lash out at the nearest available target. This was something else entirely. A man who had orchestrated 7 years of another family's suffering not from any particular grievance, but from the same detached curiosity a scholar might bring to a laboratory experiment. They brought their findings to Duke Pharaoh, who brought them, in turn, quietly and carefully to the crown itself, because a plot involving outlawed enchantment reaching into the highest levels of court advisory was no longer a matter House Voss or House Pharaoh could safely handle alone. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic in its lack of drama. No moonlit terrace, no dramatic unmasking before a crowd of witnesses. Simply a quiet royal summons a locked study and Lord Haldon Grey's mild, unremarkable face going very still as the evidence was laid before him piece by careful piece by a king who had trusted him for 11 years and clearly found the betrayal more wounding than any of the political consequences it threatened. He did not confess as freely as Miriel had. He had spent decades, evidently, perfecting a much colder, more practiced denial than his young pupil's mother had ever managed to teach her daughter. But the evidence, Widow Callow's careful documentation, the royal archive's quietly damning records, and most damning of all, a search of his private chambers that turned up 2 further memory-binding artifacts he had no legal explanation for possessing, proved sufficient where confession did not. Lord Haldon Grey was stripped of his position and titles, and remanded to the Crown's justice under considerably less mercy than Miriel Thorne had received, given the scale and calculation of what he'd orchestrated across not merely House Voss, but the subsequent investigation slowly, horrifyingly revealed, No fewer than 4 other noble families over the preceding 2 decades, each one destabilized or destroyed for reasons that appeared to serve no purpose beyond his own private unknowable design. As for Miriel, the letter's claim proved mercifully false. She had reached her port of exile after all, delayed only by weather, very much alive and according to the brief formal correspondence that eventually confirmed it, beginning some manner of quiet, anonymous life in a distant province where no one knew her name or her history. Elara found she was glad of it, in a complicated, unresolved way she suspected she would spend years still untangling. Not forgiveness, precisely. Something more like the simple relief of a story finally, fully closing, without one more unnecessary death weighing down its ending. "It's over," Cashin said quietly, the evening after Lord Grey's arrest was formally announced, the two of them standing once more in the Voss stable yard where this entire second chance had first begun. Truly over this time, not merely the visible threat, the hand behind it too. Elara pressed her palm against Willow's warm neck, the same gesture she'd made as an 11-year-old girl discovering, with disbelieving relief, that her beloved mare still drew breath. "I keep waiting to feel it," she admitted. "That sense of finally being safe. I've been braced for the next blow for so long, Cashin. I'm not entirely certain I remember how to simply stand still and let a peaceful moment be exactly what it is." Cashin's hand found hers, warm and steady in the cooling evening air. "Then perhaps," he said, "we learn together. I find I'm equally out of practice." Above them, the first stars were emerging in a sky finally fully clear of storm clouds for the first time in what felt to Elara like 7 very long years, and somewhere in the quiet space between one breath and the next, she allowed herself for the very first time since waking in a garden that smelled of wet stone and crushed mint to simply uncomplicatedly hope. 3 years passed the way a life is meant to pass when no one is quietly rewriting it from the shadows. Not slowly and painfully like the first 7, but gently, almost unremarkably, the way ordinary happiness tends to feel from the inside. Even when it is anything but ordinary from the outside looking in. Elara Voss became Elara Pharaoh on a bright spring morning that owed nothing at all to scheming or survival, held in the same grand hall of House Pharaoh, where a hairpin had once nearly ended everything and where 3 years prior 7 witnesses had instead ensured it never got the chance. She wore ivory instead of midnight blue this time, and when she climbed the aisle toward Cashin, her hands did not shake at all, not the trembling of a woman braced for catastrophe, but the small, ordinary flutter of a woman genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. Her mother wept through the entire ceremony, and afterward held Elara's face in both hands with an intensity that needed no further explanation between them. An apology 7 years in the making, finally, wordlessly complete. Her father gruffer but no less moved. Gave a toast at the wedding breakfast that mentioned with visible difficulty how proud he was of the woman his daughter had become, and did not once mention the years he'd spent doubting her, because both of them understood by now that some wounds healed better left unspoken and simply. Steadily proven wrong through everything that came after. Widow Callow attended, sharp-eyed and typically unimpressed by pageantry, though Elara caught her dabbing discreetly at her eyes during the vows and chose, generously, never to mention it. Ophelia sat in the front row beside Elara's parents, an honor typically reserved for family, because by then everyone present understood that was, in every way that mattered, precisely what she was. Priscilla Ashworth attended too, having become in the strange way former rivals sometimes do. One of Elara's closest friends, the two of them having discovered across 3 years of dinners and shared confidences and easy understanding built on mutual respect, rather than any romantic entanglement either had ever actually wanted with Cashin in the first place. Duke Pharaoh gave the bridal. At Elara's own quiet request, her own father having graciously agreed to the arrangement as a public gesture of the alliance between their houses. But Elara suspected, watching the old Duke's stern face soften as he walked her down the aisle, that the gesture had become, somewhere along the way, considerably less symbolic and considerably more sincere than either of them had originally intended. Of Miriel, there was no word, not at the wedding, not in the months surrounding it. Elara had written to her once the year prior. A brief and careful letter forwarded through the distant province's magistrate's office containing neither forgiveness nor condemnation, only a simple factual account of Lord Grey's exposure and arrest, so that Miriel might at least understand the fuller shape of the story she had been in the end. Merely one instrument within, no reply ever came. Elara had not truly expected one. Some stories, she had come to understand, simply ended in silence rather than resolution, and there was its own kind of peace in learning to accept that too. Standing now at the center of the grand hall, Cashin's hand, warm around hers the weight of a golden band, newly settled on her finger, Elara found her gaze drifting unbidden toward the terrace doors at the far end of the room, the same doors that had once swung open to reveal 7 witnesses and a shattering truth on a night that had changed the entire remaining shape of her life. "You're thinking about it again," Cashin murmured against her ear, close enough that only she could hear. "The terrace. I think about it more often than I probably should on my wedding day," Elara admitted, smiling despite herself. "Not with fear anymore, just gratitude, I suppose. That the worst night of this life happened to also be the night that made all of this possible. That's the strange mathematics of surviving something I've found," Cashin said quietly. "The very worst moments and the very best ones have an uncomfortable habit of growing from the exact same soil." Elara thought of an 11-year-old girl standing frozen in a garden, disbelieving her own borrowed heartbeat. She thought of 7 years spent learning to be careful, watchful, quietly ruthless in defense of a truth no one else could see. She thought of a rope, a platform, a laugh that had sounded broken even to her own ears, and of opening her eyes afterward to birdsong and spring and an impossible second chance she had very nearly wasted from sheer disbelief that it was real. She thought, too, of Miriel, not with hatred, not anymore, but with the particular complicated sorrow reserved for someone who had once, briefly, been offered the same family and had simply been handed a much crueler set of tools to survive it with. 2 girls failed differently by the same imperfect people, and only one of them had found her way, eventually, to something like grace. That was the lesson Elara thought that she suspected she would carry for the rest of whatever remained of this second. Hard-won life, that the world would always be tempted to hand someone a villain's name simply, because a villain was convenient simpler than the messy, unglamorous truth of ordinary people making ordinary devastating mistakes under ordinary pressures. That reputations, once written, take considerably longer to unwrite than they ever took to build. And that vindication, when it finally arrived, rarely felt like triumph so much as it felt like exhaustion finally, gently permitted to rest. But she had learned something else too, across 7 brutal years and 3 gentler ones that followed them. That patience, wielded honestly, could outlast even the most perfectly constructed lie. That evidence, gathered carefully and shared with the right witnesses at the right moment, could unmake in a single terrace-lit instant what 7 years of careful cruelty had built. That a person could be called villainous by an entire kingdom and still, quietly, stubbornly, remain the most innocent soul in the room, because innocence was never about what people believed of you. It was about what remained true of you, underneath every lie anyone ever told to obscure it. The orchestra began its first slow, sweeping song of the evening, and Cashin drew her gently into the first dance of their marriage, the golden light of the grand hall wrapping around them both like something earned rather than simply given. "No more waiting for the next blow to fall," Elara said softly, more to herself than to him, testing the words the way one tests unfamiliar ground. "No more," Cashin agreed, "only whatever we choose to build next." And Elara Voss, who had once died believing herself the most hated woman in Valcrest, and who had been given against every reasonable expectation the exceedingly rare gift of writing her own story a second time, closed her eyes for just a moment, felt the warmth of her husband's hand at her waist and the golden light against her closed lids, and let herself at long last simply completely belong to a life no one else's lie would ever again have the power to take from her. The villainess everyone had feared had never been a villainess at all. She had only ever been the one person, in a kingdom full of convenient lies, who refused to stop telling the truth.